How did an individual as vile as Elon Musk come to control a public platform like Twitter? Is Musk just the most extreme example of a far wider problem in the social media industry ownership structure? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mu'in Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Marwa Fatafta. Marwa Fatafta is a Palestinian digital rights advocate and writer based in Berlin, but joining us today from Amman, Jordan. She leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region. Her work focuses on issues of content moderation, freedom of expression, surveillance, and privacy, and she's written extensively on the intersection of technology and human rights. Marwa Fatafta, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections, or rather to welcome you back to Connections, because a little over a year ago, we also discussed the Pegasus NSO digital spying scandal.
Thank you, Marian. It's really great to be back.
Great. I suppose let's start for those of us who haven't followed the details of Twitter in recent months. How did Elon Musk come in control of that platform? Because if I recall correctly, he indicated he wanted to buy it, and then he tried to back out, and then there were threats of a court case, and then he ended up taking control and seems since then to have his heart set on running it into the ground.
Yeah, indeed. It was a long saga. Maybe the short version of it is that, Musk being an avid Twitter user, signaled his interest in purchasing the platform, and then made these statements around how he wants to free the bird, about his grandiose plans around content moderation, being a freedom of expression absolutist, and then we saw Musk basically attacking the leadership of Twitter on Twitter. And then he tried to exactly get himself out of the deal. Could be for financial reasons. Maybe he saw or struggled to put together the price tag of buying Twitter, which the deal was sealed at $44 billion US. And Twitter took Musk to court. It caused a lot of anxiety among Twitter staff and leadership when the intention or the deal was announced. And then, he used bots because bots were bugging him. Bots were bugging Musk, and then he was saying that I need to see more information around how many bots are on the platform, how Twitter is battling or eliminating these bots, and try to use that as a point of pressure, I think, to get out of the deal. But it was sealed on the 27th of October this year. And what he did since then has been very concerning and dramatic at the same time. First of all, he took Twitter private. I mean, since 2013, Twitter has been a publicly traded company, which means that it has independent shareholders as well as shareholders from the executives and also Twitter employees, etc. He dissolved the board of directors, which functioned as a sort of checks and balances type of body.
Sorry, just to be clear, he's now the sole owner and decision maker within Twitter.
Exactly. And that's really concerning. I mean, we can talk more about why it is problematic to begin with that critical online public spaces are in the hands of few powerful people that can decide basically on a whim what can and cannot be done, what can and cannot be said on platforms. But Musk has indeed taken it to the extreme, being the sole director of Twitter. And the fact that because now Twitter is a private company, you don't have independent shareholders. And in this case, he is less, let's say, exposed to public scrutiny. He doesn't have public shareholders that he has to be accountable for. He is accountable to his private investors, one of which is, or the second largest of which are a Saudi holding company. That also raises a host of other question marks and concerns around privacy and freedom of expression in this part of the world, in the Middle East and North Africa. And he also, he immediately got rid of the top 4 executives in the company, including the CEO, the head of the legal and policy, a person who has been pretty active on the civil rights front and even getting Twitter to be involved in litigation against government encroachment of freedom of expression in places like Nigeria and India. Their general counsel and also their top finance person, all that tier was immediately removed.
Basically, the entire leadership.
Exactly, yeah. I think, he doesn't want any resistance to whatever he decides. And we've seen that pretty much since he took hold of Twitter, he's been tweeting his plans and his vision about Twitter, one tweet at a time. Pretty much everything is done in an ad hoc manner, in a very amateur manner. He dismissed half of Twitter's employees. Twitter had around 7,500 employees. Half of that is already gone, including extremely critical teams for the platform to function in a safe and secure manner. The human rights team, which is responsible for overseeing Twitter's obligations and responsibilities under international human rights law, that team is gone. Their ethics team on AI and ethics gone. The team that also oversees security and safety has been heavily affected and gutted. Engineers and he also fired. He fired third-party contractors, so content reviewers that the company has relied on in the past to moderate content on the platform also has been removed. I think there were around 5,000 persons in total, and 4,000 have been dismissed.
These are third-party contractors, basically.
Those are the third-party contractors, because social media companies have to rely on private contracts with other companies to moderate content. And so that's a valuable resource to the company, also slashed. And since then, Twitter has been gutted and all of his content moderation decisions has been chaotic so far. And, we can also dig into that a bit, but this is the current situation.
Let's discuss that, because media coverage has very much been focused on the one hand on the chaos that Musk has been engaging in, and on the other, as you just mentioned, firing thousands of employees, dozens of others resigning in disgust at his edict, and then, of course, allowing Trump and other far-right figures back onto the platform. When you look at this entire mess, have you been able to discern an agenda that Musk is pursuing, or is it just making it up as he goes along without knowing where he's heading?
I wish we know what he is really thinking, because he's been, he is an unreliable person. He's made a lot of statements. Some of it, I have to say, comes from a pure place of ignorance. He really thinks he knows how to moderate content. He really thinks he knows how a social media platform runs. But when you see the tweets, some of those tweets are really laughable, like how his understanding of what freedom of expression means, before he sealed the deal, right? When he just announced that he's interested in buying Twitter and he made his bid, he made a couple of statements around how Twitter is an important public square and how important it is for him to keep and maintain that, and that from now on he will make sure that the company will not moderate content in an arbitrary and opaque manner, and that he will follow the law, and so users should be assured that Twitter will not remove content unless, of course, it's considered illegal. Mm-hmm. And you see that it's a very, of course, US-centric view around freedom of expression. thinking that, you know, that you have the First Amendment, you have these strong safeguards around free speech, rights and freedoms that are not afforded to many people who are living under authoritarian regimes around the world, where laws are repressive, where laws do not take the interest of the internet user and citizens in mind, but think about how governments can actually control and police online speech and activity. You know, think about countries like Iran or Saudi Arabia or China, Egypt. I mean, these are countries who have put in place a number of extremely repressive and vague legislation on counterterrorism, cybercrime laws, and the whole aim here is to eliminate, crack down, and prosecute anyone who shares or says something that the government doesn't agree with. So from that perspective, if Twitter has to follow local law, it means that Twitter will be censoring a lot of people. But you know, Musk thinks that he knows, you know, he knows better than anybody. He knows better than civil society. He knows better than content moderation experts and everyone who has been in this business for over a decade and understand the challenges as well as the solutions for how to moderate content at scale in a way that respects people's rights and allows them to express themselves freely. So he's coming at it from a place of ignorance, but also a place of arrogance. So far, he has not consulted with any of the experts we know or the civil society organizations that has been working on these thorny issues for quite some time, and you know, have some clues around how to solve some of those, you know, legitimate problems around hate speech and disinformation and bots, etc. I think he only reached out to ADL and a bunch of, you know, American organizations. Depending on who you ask, that can also be problematic. You know, if you ask Palestinians,
To say the least.
who have, yeah, you know, for Palestinians, we've been. How the expression goes, like the canary in the coal mine.
Yes, well, on that score, I mean, you've been speaking about Musk getting rid of content moderation and these types of things, but as you well know, particularly given your focus on digital rights in the Middle East, these in principle perhaps laudable content moderation policies have been systematically instrumentalized by Israel and its apologists abroad to silence not only any criticism of Israel, but any advocacy, any and all advocacy where possible of Palestinian rights. So isn't his dismantling of these structures a good thing?
You know, social media hasn't been exactly kind to Palestinians and other oppressed communities around the world. Let's start from the fact that, as you've mentioned, you know, the majority of users of big tech platforms are placed outside of the US. We're talking about 80 to 90% of their user base, whether it be Twitter,
they tend to be primarily American companies.
They are American companies, but 80 to 90% of their users are outside of the US. But because of liability, because of regulation, because of also market interest, these companies have concentrated their resources to moderate, you know, disinformation and other ailment, you know, of social media platforms in the US, and left the rest of us basically to our own devices. Whether, you know, whether it be on the content moderation policies themselves or the way they're implementing them and enforcing them, where you don't have sufficient staff and team that understand the local languages, understand dialects, understand the socioeconomic, political, and you know, social and cultural fabric of societies. And as a result of that, we've seen like all these arbitrary and opaque censorship of Palestinian voices and many others. Now, Musk taking over, and also if you see how he is managing content moderation, he's asking people to tag him on Twitter. You know, if they've seen some you know, child abuse or exploitative content, that people should tag him things like that, which makes you think, okay, so if someone tells him, here, look at this Palestinian content, these are terrorists, and he thinks, yeah, this is content
So
that
it's
should
the
be removed.
arbitrariness of it that you're.
Yeah, so he will exacerbate that. I don't think him getting rid of content moderation structures will actually alleviate the pressures and the censorship that Palestinians and many others have faced for quite some time. I would say he will actually make it, he'll take it from bad to worse. He will make issues related to safety of users worse. Censorship, he'll make it worse. Because, as I mentioned, we already coming from a place where there hasn't been sufficient resources allocated to moderate Arabic content. And now that the teams or Twitter is being gutted, who is there actually to moderate properly or answer to any issues related to user security and safety? There is
So
so
it will become a site where the powerful prevail in terms of the resources they're able to bring to promoting their disinformation and political agendas and so forth.
exactly. And just going back to your question, like, is he what's going on? Like, based on some of his tweets he made, bringing Trump back, bringing bringing right-wing and disinformation and very shady actors who have been banned on the platform. It's clear to us that he has right-wing leanings, and those actors are also happy and lobbying him, like, hey, finally, you are freeing Twitter from left-wing maniacs and lunatics. Ted Cruz and Trump has also hailed him for his work. So when you see this, who is basically happy about him taking over, you don't necessarily have good assurances that he will focus on human rights, but
yeah.
he will have an ideological approach to content moderation, which is pretty bad.
I mean, he did prohibit far-right illusionist extremist Alex Jones from returning to Twitter, but at the same time welcomed Trump and others, again, as you have suggested, as a arbitrary personal decision rather than any company policy or on the basis of any content moderation and so on. But let's now return to the issue of ownership and zoom out a bit. We've just discussed Twitter. You also have Facebook, which is primarily controlled also by one individual, Mark Zuckerberg, and also other social media platforms, which you've described as public platforms, but often tend to be dominated by a single or a handful of excessively wealthy individuals. What does this say about the extent to which these companies should indeed be considered public platforms rather than, let's say, personal interests?
That's a really good question. I mean, when Musk took over Twitter and all the madness ensued, it raised two very important questions. One is around the fragility of these public spheres that we came to rely on for professional work, for our careers, for our activism, for sharing, disseminating information, accessing that information, mobilizing and organizing, etc. And the handing over, at the end of the day, they are owned by few individuals. And in the case of Twitter now, as I mentioned, Musk is taking it to become a private company, which exacerbates the issue around consolidation of power and this outsized power that companies have over online speech. For many communities around the world, Twitter, Facebook are the internet. And when they are in the hands of pretty much 1 to 2 persons, or maybe just one person who has considerable power around rules of speech, who is allowed to speak and who isn't. And of course, these companies are based in the US, and there's a host of other issues around regulation and understanding of speech around the world. Now, so there is that issue, you know, like when when a company like Twitter has been traded like that, we're not just talking about a company in that sense. It has a public interest function, and there should have been more scrutiny, I think, in my opinion, around investors and how investors have happily decided to sell their shares and hand it to
Well,
Musk in this case.
and in this case, Marwa, also specifically, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, was already pursuing Twitter and had imposed certain obligations on it, which it is now, I think, technically incapable of fulfilling, given how many, given how much of the company has been dismantled. So are you suggesting basically that the government regulators should have prohibited this sale, prevented it, or at least imposed and implemented stringent conditions for it to move forward?
Well, I don't know if, you know, I'm not an expert on US corporate law. I don't know in this case what are the legal obligations, but let's look at it from a human rights point of view. Companies and business enterprises do have an obligation under, you know, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which are kind of the Bible for how companies can protect, respect, and provide remedy whenever there are human rights violations.
And which are
And
honored primarily in the breach.
they are honored. I mean, Twitter, for instance, yeah, and most of actually, if not all, social media platforms subscribe to that and are a member of different networks, and where they've made public commitments around the fact that they are following the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And as part of that, when there are these types of deals, there should have been, for example, human rights impact assessments around whether this deal would come or threaten human rights abusers, and ensure that there are mitigation measures. None of that happened clearly. And so again, you know, it raises questions around not only what happens at the, let's say, the front level, the interaction with the user, but also at the backroom deals. Who's passing what to who, and are they taking human rights into consideration? You know, one thing I want to mention here about the importance of investors and how they can influence company decisions. Last year, you know, Google announced that they want to expand their work and open a cloud region in Saudi Arabia, from all places, a country that is notorious for their surveillance activities. And Google thought it's a great idea for them to build a cloud region where personal data of many users will be handled by that government. And we raised a lot of concerns, and one of our partners submitted...
We being Access Now.
Yeah, Access Now, exactly. And one of our partners submitted a shareholder resolution at their General Assembly this year. The majority of independent voter, I think it was around 57% of their independent shareholders, questioned and voted against basically Google expanding their business operations in countries with poor human rights record. So this type of investor advocacy and activism is important. Now with Twitter, unfortunately, these voices are absent because, you know, Twitter and Musk and his friends are in hold of the Twitter corporate structure. So there is that, and then of course the second issue that I wanted to mention is, again, when we talk about social media platforms, the era of self-regulation, can we really afford these critical platforms to continue in their centralized content governance system? Because there is the corporate structure, but there's also the content governance structures, which have been so far around or modeled around self-regulation. That platforms are free to decide their own rules on what can and cannot be said on the platform. Therefore, they come in with their own content moderation standards or terms of services. Under Section 230 in the US, that's the agreement that, they are not liable for publishing user-generated content because
as
they're not
opposed to a
traditionally
newspaper or television broadcaster.
Exactly. As long as, they moderate harmful content in good faith, hence, all these standards around hate speech and disinformation and violence and extremism, etc. And I think we've come to a point of maturity, and a lot of government regulators are already thinking about, okay, we've tried the self-regulation model for over a decade now. It's not working for different reasons, and it's time to change that. And so we've seen, I don't think, the US, there's been a number of proposals on the table. The EU has a very promising prospect on that. They, passed recently the Digital Services Act, which is the first government regulation that really aims at downsizing the power of big tech and ensuring that they are transparent by law and not just by good intention, which is really good. The DSA came into effect on the, I believe, 14th or 16th of November.
The Digital Services Act.
Yeah. And it will be interesting to see actually how Musk will manage that, how will manage Twitter obligations under the DSA, which came into effect very recently, last month, this year.
And moving forward, what in your view are the 2 or 3 most important measures that need to be taken to control these behemoths? Is it breaking them up in terms of Facebook no longer being allowed to also own WhatsApp and so on? Is it much more stringent regulations to replace self-regulations, as you were just discussing? Are there other measures that we haven't touched on yet? There's very clearly a problem with multiple dimensions, as we've been discussing. What would be the most important policy recommendations you would propose in this respect?
I think the first around government regulation, as I mentioned, self-regulation is problematic for a number of reasons. In some contexts, it can be actually good. When you talk about in context of authoritarianism or digital authoritarianism, it's good that platforms have a bit of that independence from government regulation. Still, when we talk about the big players, meaning the EU and the US, these are the 2 biggest kind of power blocks that have that can influence our digital ecosystem. The government regulation, like the DSA, and has a lot of promises because it doesn't look specifically at banning content per se, but bringing new laws and obligations on platforms around transparency and transparency around, for example, their algorithms, so algorithmic transparency. What systems are platforms using? How accurate are they? Transparency around government dealing and government requests for users' data and content removal. Transparency to the users themselves. So when platforms take down content or take any sort of action like account suspension, they should tell and notify users, hey, we've taken your content because X, Y, Z. So there is reasoning, and also allowing users to appeal those decisions. In the case of the DSA, for example, now platforms have to, by law, provide that remedy mechanism where users can report and appeal. They can also take, kind of out of court remedy mechanisms to settle that. Which I think is very, very important. It kind of allows the user to claim back a bit of power over their speech. Also, according to the DSA, now platforms have to, very large online platforms. So we're talking about platforms that have 45 million users plus. Those will also have to be subject to mandatory independent audits, which is groundbreaking, if you ask me. I mean, I've been working on content moderation for 7 years now, and most of the times we are left to our own devices. We can just connect the dots around how platforms are making decisions based on users' experience. You know, the case of Palestine, for example, we've been saying for a long time, you know, companies are discriminating against Palestinians. Companies do have biased content moderation policies and rules. And finally, very recently, Meta, under pressure from civil society and their
Meta
oversight
being
board.
Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. Meta being Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. It's the kind of the mother company. They finally agreed to conduct an independent investigation or human rights due diligence around their content moderation decisions back in May 2021, you know, during the events of Sheikh Jarrah and Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And the results were published in September this year. And indeed, BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, were commissioned to do the the due diligence, and they found that indeed Meta was unintentionally biased against Palestinians. They found that Meta had over-enforced their policies around Palestinian and Arabic speech while they under-moderated hate speech in Hebrew. And they also found that, you know, Meta's actions have negatively impacted Palestinians' rights to freedom of expression, to association and assembly online, the right to non-discrimination, the right to political participation, the right to bodily security. So there was a host of fundamental rights that were violated as a result.
And have there been any changes since that report was published?
Not yet, and that's our job basically, to ensure that the recommendations that have been made by BSR are fully implemented. And this takes me, you know, going back to your original question, sorry, I digressed a bit here, that in addition to government regulation, ensuring transparency around these rules and how they're being enforced, we also need companies to co-design their policies with people that are impacted by those decisions and policies. And so going back to the question of Twitter, you know, I highly doubt that Musk will turn around. I'm very skeptical of Twitter's future. I mean, advertisers are already pulling out. They don't want to be associated with a platform that is a cesspool for hate speech and disinformation. And, you know, Musk is now trying his best to generate income and profits off advertisers and the subscription verification subscription scheme, which didn't work out, and he had to put it on hold.
A failed gimmick.
Yeah. And so to what extent can he actually keep the platform floating? I'm not so sure, based on every stupid decision he's made so far. But let's say in an optimistic prospect, he should speak to human rights experts. He should speak to people who have been in the business of content moderation and know what can and cannot work. And I think these are the top two, let's say, policy recommendations.
Okay, but let's go back briefly to regulations, and you sounded somewhat optimistic, or quite optimistic, about what's happening in Brussels with the European Union, despite the best efforts of these social media giants to exercise political influence and lobby European politicians. At the end of the day, these are European decision makers regulating American companies. If, by contrast, you look at the United States, I think it's fair to say that the majority of politicians are, in one way or another, already in the pockets of these companies. The industry basically writes the rules for Congress to adopt and regulating them. Given how the U.S. legislative process works. And so the question is, do you think it's realistic to expect significant improvement in US regulation of US social media giants?
That's a really good question. And I think in the US, I'm a bit less optimistic for a couple of reasons. One, the EU legislation are applicable only to the EU. So if you are a European citizen or live in the EU, these rules apply to you. Nevertheless, the EU has been a champion, and I don't want to sound like an EU spokesperson, but let's give credit where credit is due. They have spearheaded a number of initiatives and legislation that have changed the online ecosystem around the world and beyond the EU to much higher standards. I mean, take, for example, their General Data Protection Framework, the GDPR. It's, even though it's an EU legislation,
It had global impact.
It has become the golden standard on data protection, and many companies strive to comply or even implement and develop their own kind of data protection standards in compliance with the EU. And I see the DSA in the same light. I see the DSA, even though it is applicable only on EU, where EU jurisdiction applies, but I believe it will have that spillover effect, and it will change the ecosystem in a more positive direction, especially because the US has been lagging behind on a number of fronts, not only freedom of expression, but also data protection and privacy. It's really incredible how the US is so behind when they are the hosts of the biggest tech companies in the world. Yes. Exactly for the reasons you've mentioned. I think the dynamics are different. Not to dismiss or downsize that. Of course, these companies are present in Brussels and trying their best to lobby EU legislation to their advantage. But in the US, it's a different dynamic. And so if American politicians are not able to do that, well, let someone else can. And at least, the legislative process has been open to civil society. There's been, Access Now. My colleagues in the Brussels office have done an amazing job providing input, a very concrete input into these legislations. And so that's a really good track. We're on a good track on that level. I don't think the US, it will be the same, but let's see, of course,
how it plays out.
What will happen in the next few years.
On that note, Marwa Fatafta, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. And our next episode will be next Wednesday, the 7th of December, when we will be speaking with the author Maya Mikdashi about her new book, Sextarianism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maureen.